So let's talk about heart rate zones and heart rate training. You eventually reach a point in your evolution as an athlete, oftentimes because your recovery prowess just starts declining and you start looking for ways to continue to improve. But it should definitely happen way before, and in my opinion, it should happen as early as possible. But at some point, you become curious about heart rate training and what the purpose behind it is. And this is definitely a good thing. Joel Jamieson talks about heart rate training the same way you would talk about percentage training, RPE-based training when it comes to weight training. Like, if you are not aware of what your heart rate is doing while you're going through your conditioning sessions, it'd be the equivalent to going into a strength test session and not knowing what the plates weigh. And you're not allowed to rack it, up until you're done with the set, or up until you attempt the set at least. This of course will turn into a huge mess. But this essentially is what you're doing when you're going into your conditioning sessions without a clear intent and without being aware of where you should be in each set or throughout the whole thing. Now, the easiest way to talk about this is to reference heart rate zone models. The most popular is the 5-zone model that I'm gonna put right here. The zones 1 and 2 are what's considered aerobic training, okay, or aerobic capacity. This is well below threshold, and it should be a comfortable pace, a pace that you can talk at. Zone 3, it starts getting into threshold work. Okay, this is a pace that is still somewhat sustainable, but you're like knocking at the gates of like redlining. Then you have zone 4, which is a bit of an unsustainable pace, past threshold, but it's one that you can still repeat and maybe extend for a decent duration. You can go into like a minute or 2, maybe even here. And finally, you go into zone 5, which is like the strictly max effort, max output, all out training, unsustainable paces. You can only push them for like 20 to 30 seconds, and you need like a decent chunk of rest to be able to repeat them. Okay, we're talking 3-4 minutes. Now, as you can see, their percentages are given for all of this, but as you get into training and you go through the ups and downs of just regular training and training blocks, things are not always perfect. And a lot of these are based on like threshold, ventilatory thresholds, like aerobic thresholds and lactate thresholds, that are more of ranges oftentimes. Plus, you're trying to like count on the gear that you're using. If you're using wrist-based devices, it might not be that accurate. Even a chest strap might not be perfect. So it's helpful to understand the concepts behind what these numbers mean and not like obsessed about sticking like to 153 BPMs per minute. Now, the upper ends of training tend to be like the most glamorous ones, I guess. It's the hard ones. It's the ones where you go all out and you feel like you're doing something. A lot of the times, the upper ends of our output and performance will be dictated by genetics, and they're not very receptive to training. Meanwhile, the lower ends of training are in fact very well receptive to training, and this is where most of your focus should be in. You should be prioritizing the lower ends, aerobic and even threshold work for more advanced athletes. Now, the conversation about this goes back to the energy systems, and for videos on that I've made, I'll put some up here on lactate thresholds and different ways of training them, and I'll put the links below as well. And there's some confusion here because if you look it up online, you'll find all these different graphs talking about different percentages and base it off of different things: max heart rate, FTP, like functional threshold power, and it just becomes a whole mess. It's like, are we talking about a 5-zone model, a 3-zone model? What are we talking about? So I'm gonna try to clarify here in this video and not confuse you any more than I probably already have, but I think it's more helpful for any person in general to talk about a 3-zone model. Okay, and you essentially take zones 1 and 2 and make it into one. You have your threshold work, zone 3, and then zone 4 and 5 are your above threshold work, and you just leave it at that. Okay, if you're a more advanced athlete, if you're more of an elite athlete, you do in fact need to be more picky, more methodical about what you're doing. That is just the name of the game, and that's how it is. But if you're not an elite runner, if you're not an elite athlete, this is like overkill. Don't worry about all of this. Think about it like this. You have your aerobic work. This is your zone 1 work. And this should be a sustainable pace and a pace that you can talk comfortably at, okay? If you were to talk for a little too long, you will run out of breath. Following this guideline will stop you from pushing too far, maybe into zone 3 and near threshold, because that is not a pace that you can continue talking at. But oftentimes it's the pace that we end up choosing because it feels better and it feels like a higher effort. Next up is your threshold work, which will be like zone 2. This is a pace that is sustainable, but you need to be like on your game. Like it's a hard pace to follow. You might only be able to push it for like 4 minutes, 6 minutes, and you need to take a little bit of a break in between, or you might be able to push it for a little further into like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, okay? And one set of that might be enough, you know? If you're trying to do threshold and doing like shorter sets, then yeah, you can do 4, 5, 6 sets of those, you know, taking like a minute or 2 in between. But if you're pushing this into like the 10, 15 minute time domain, you know, and still doing threshold work, you should be aware of how much volume you're doing. Okay, if you want to do 2 sets, take a longer break. Take 10 minutes in between each set at a like recovery pace, like very slow. Get on a treadmill and just chill there. Continue moving, but slow. Finally, you have your high intensity work, and this will be everything above threshold work. Okay, max effort. Like I said, if you're not an elite athlete, don't worry about like making the differences, okay? You're going for a minute as hard as you can, okay, and taking 3 minutes in between each set. And you want to be hitting like, I don't know, 5, 6 sets of these. And that's all your training. Try to split it out evenly throughout the week. Most of your training should be done at the lower intensities. Most of your training, if you're just chasing health and longevity, should be done at a zone 1. Okay, the easier, the aerobic work, where you need to accrue 40 minutes in one session. If you want to like spice it up a little bit, maybe do 2 of those sessions a week and leave 1 session of very high intensity. That is a very good way of doing it, and you're essentially just skipping tempo work or threshold work. Like, don't even need it. If you maybe are a more advanced athlete that already has a very good aerobic capacity, like if your resting heart rate is already in the 40s, then yeah, you might see a lot of benefits from doing threshold work. So you'll be switching some of your lower intensity works from some threshold work. Maybe you're doing 3 days a week, and one of those days is fully aerobic, one of the days is threshold work, and one of those days is high intensity work. That is another perfectly acceptable split that you can run. Now, if you're a recreational athlete and you're just trying to get a better handle on all of these things, you do not need to like mess around with gear and watches and chest straps and numbers and math and everything you can do, because you can get complicated. Like, I think one of the most effective ways of figuring out your zone 2 pace or your like aerobic capacity pace is essentially taking an FTP test, a functional threshold power test, which is just going for an hour at the best pace you can. Like, that is a heinous test. Okay, there's a way of shortening it, but you still gotta go for 20 minutes at the absolute best pace you can like handle. You're essentially suffering the most you can for 20 minutes. And then you take the wattage and your heart rate and your average heart rate, and you take like the percentages of that to come up with a range. Like don't bother with all that, okay? Just learn how to go by feel. Like, this is an important skill that you should learn anyways. Like, when am I in trouble? When am I comfortable? And when am I just going all out? So zone 1, easy training work. You should be able to talk, but not for too long. That's the feeling that you're chasing. Threshold work, you can sustain it. Maybe not more than 10, 15 minutes, okay? Or maybe even harder if you're going to like the 4-minute threshold. But you have to be on your game. Like, you have to be on your game to stay there. You know, it requires a lot of effort. And finally, all out intensity work. You know, start in the 1 minute to 90 second range, going all out, and then as you progress and you get better, you can actually start cutting it down to the point that you're doing like this like 20-30 second sets at like all out effort, like absolutely all out. And you should be able to replicate this. So if you go into a high intensity training session and you know that the intent is to go all out, but you're not able to sustain it, okay, let's say you're looking at the calories on the rower and you're hitting like 1200 for a minute straight, okay, and then you take 3 to 4 minutes of rest and you cannot hit 1200 again, you might not be ready for that kind of training. There is some truth to the fact that you do need to know your max heart rate, and this I would save it if you really want to go the extra mile and be actually very technical about what you're doing and very proper about what you're doing. You need to figure out your max heart rate, and you need to figure out your lactate threshold. Best way of doing this is using a chest strap for all these tests, okay? If you want to be proper, you should be doing this at least once a year, okay? Because you will get better, you will get worse, some things will happen, some things will change, like biological components will change. Your age matters in this, so do it once a year. 3 to 4 sets at a max intensity, 60 to 90 seconds, okay? You need to, more than likely you won't hit your max heart rate on the first set. That's why you're doing 2, 3, 4 maybe even, okay? and then look at the numbers that your device will tell you, and the highest one is just your max heart rate, and that's the number you use to do all your calculations. Now, your lactate threshold is another one that might be complicated. You can go to a laboratory to get this done, but another way of doing it is to simply find a movement, a full body movement. You'll always want to be using full body movements for these tests, and go hard for 4 or 5 minutes. Rest 1 minute, again, repeat it for 3 to 4 sets, and then you're gonna take your average heart rate during the sets. Don't include your rest in these calculations. And your average heart rate throughout all that work will be your lactate threshold. You can use 60 to 70% for your aerobic work from your max heart rate. And then when you wanna go into your threshold work, you know where your threshold is. And an easy way of doing this is that if you're doing shorter durations, you can just get closer to that threshold. You know, be within like 5 BPMs of that threshold. You know, if you're going a little bit longer, if you're pushing it into like 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you might want to step back a little bit further, you know, and just play with that line. And those are the basics of heart rate training. You know, it can get complicated, but if you're a novice, probably like you only need like 10% of this video is when I told you it's like zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3, and don't worry about anything else. And yeah, if you are more advanced, you probably already know what you're doing, and hopefully I can provide some light into some things you might have questions for. But yeah, that's the video for this week. Hope you got something out of it. As always, all my links are below. Please subscribe to the channel and like the video if you got something from it. And yeah, thanks for watching.
It is important to draw wisdom from many different places. If we take it from only one place, it becomes rigid and stale. Understanding others, the other elements, and the other nations will help you become whole.